Thank you for coming and attending the webinar. Welcome to the webinar titled Recent Developments in Direct Taxes. So our speaker for today is Mr. Karthik SS, Associate Director, Direct Tax at ASA and Associates. So before we begin the webinar session, here are few of the instructions. Please note that all the participants will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the questions section in the chat. The presentation will be followed by an Q&A, and the link of the recording will be emailed to you after the session is completed in a day. Kindly reach out to us if you have any difficulties with this. Thank you, and now I'll let the floor to Mr. Karthik to begin our session.
Thanks, Avinash. Good evening, everyone who's joined us for this session. The idea of doing this client clinic is to get a update ourselves on some of the recent developments that has happened over the past couple of months in the areas of direct taxation. Primarily, we'll be covering three areas during the discussion. First, relating to the faceless assessment scheme. Secondly, relating to the tax collection at source regulations, which are applicable now from October 2020. And lastly, we'll also touch upon the digital tax in terms of the equalization levy that has been introduced by way of the Finance Act this year, which is effective from April 2020. The idea of doing this is to sort of, have a date, as I said, and understand few things a little more deeply, and then also see what the changes have happened and what the implications can be in respect of that. So, starting with the faceless assessment scheme. Next slide, please. So, as we all know, I mean, it's been in the news for the last couple of months about the new scheme which has been introduced, and how things will happen in terms of faceless assessments. And of course, in fact, recently the faceless appeal scheme has also been notified. Just to give a brief background of how this scheme is supposed to work. From August 2020 onwards, all assessments which have to happen will compulsorily happen under this scheme. The way it will happen is that there is a National E-Assessment Center which has been set up. Similarly, also a Regional E-Assessment Center has been set up in various locations. The National E-Assessment Center has been set up in Delhi, and the Regional Assessment Centers have been set up in about 20 locations. And each regional assessment center will have 4 subunits under them: the assessment unit, the verification unit, the technical unit, and a review unit. The way the assessment is supposed to happen is that the assessees will be intimated to say that their ongoing assessments will be conducted under the faceless assessment scheme. So that will be the first step, where each assessee or taxpayer will receive a notice intimating them. One thing that will have to be kept in mind is the fact that all communications will happen only through the National E-Assessment Center. So all notices, communication, responses, orders, all things going forward will only come through the National Assessment Center. The Regional Assessment Center will operate as a back office to the National Assessment Center. And internally, the National Assessment Center and the Regional Assessment Center will keep interacting. But the National Assessment Center will be the one which will be front-ending the whole process or the procedure. How does it all work, and what are these 4 units? Primarily, the assessment unit is the one which will carry out the actual assessment in terms of calling for information, verifying the information, listing down the points which information that is further required from the assessee, and communicates that to the National Assessment Center, which will issue a notice Once the SSE submits the information, the assessment national center will forward that information back to the assessment unit, and then basis that the assessment unit will finalize a draft assessment order. In the course of doing this assessment, the assessment unit can also take the help of the verification unit and the technical unit. Basically, the verification unit is going to help the assessment unit in terms of where any information that the assessing officer will want to verify independently from any other third party by way of issuing 133 notices, etc. All of that process will be handled by the verification unit. Where the technical unit comes into play is that the technical unit will be not there in every regional assessment center. These are specialized units covering specific areas such as transfer pricing, valuations, etc. And in the course of the assessment, again, wherever inputs are required from these in these areas, specifically, for example, the transfer pricing, the valuation, as the case may be, the assessment unit will take the support of the technical unit. Interestingly, the other thing that also is to be noted of is the fact that even in such instances when assessment unit requires the support of verification unit and the technical unit, all the communication will be routed through the National Assessment Center, which means all of these units will be working independently. In fact, when the assessment unit makes a request, the request for verification may in fact land up at the verification unit, which is there at another regional assessment center, and not necessarily in the same regional assessment center. So all of this will happen through an automated process and computer selection process where randomly the cases or the requests will get allotted. Once the assessment unit finalizes the draft order, the same is communicated to the national center. The national center will have the option to either finalize the order in case where there's nothing prejudicial to the SSE, or issue a show cause notice to the SSE to say that if there are any modifications which are prejudicial to the interest of the SSE, or independently take a call to forward it to a review unit. The role of the review unit is basically to independently review what has been done in the course of the assessment and either concur with what has been the findings or suggest any modifications. In case any modifications are suggested, then the National Center will again send it back to a different assessment unit, not the one which had originally drafted the order, and ask them to verify or make suitable modifications based on the inputs reviewed from the review unit. And in case where the review unit, the assessment unit, once the assessment unit makes these modifications, the revised draft order will again come back to the National Center, where again the National Center has the option to either finalize the order if there are no based on the modifications. Again, if there are no actions which are prejudicial to the SSE, or issue a show cause notice to the SSE. Once the show cause notice is issued to the SSE has the option to has the requirement to respond to the show cause notice in terms of information or specific queries that the center would have, which will be issued by the show cause notice. In the course of doing this, responding to the show cause notice, the SSE has the option to request for a hearing, and the hearing can happen either directly by the SSE or through its authorized representative. Once a request is received for a hearing, the commissioner heading the regional assessment center will take a call on whether hearing is warranted, and if they believe it is warranted, that's when they will give the option of a hearing. And when the hearing will happen, again, the hearing will not happen physically or in person. It will happen through a video conferencing facility. I think this is one important aspect that I'll want to highlight. Whereas in earlier instances when the assessments would happen on a face-to-face basis, the taxpayer always had the option to drop into the tax office and request the officer or request a meeting with the officer to be able to explain things in person. But the way things are, and I would say, unfortunately, that's not the case in the faceless assessment scheme. where even when a request is made by the taxpayer, it is at the discretion of the commissioner there to grant that permission or not. Interestingly, a similar provision is there in the recently introduced faceless appeal scheme as well. And what has happened is that uh, the one of the taxpayers has filed a writ petition in Delhi, and that has been admitted, the Delhi High Court, and it's been admitted on 16th October, and the High Court, basically it was on the same premise to say that that it can't be at the discretion of the commissioner to decide when a hearing will be granted or not. It should be granted to all taxpayers in all circumstances. The writ petition has thankfully been admitted, and the next hearing is due on 15 December. So it will be interesting to see what the outcome of that writ petition will be. Again, to specifically mention, this is in relation to the faceless appeal scheme, but I'm assuming that whatever will be the outcome of that petition will more likely than not be a guiding influence for the assessment scheme as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I said, so these are the various units. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as I was mentioning, so this is how the whole process would happen in terms of the notice. Just take you through. First, the notice will be issued. The assessee will have to respond within 15 days. The other thing which will also happen is that in case an assessee fails to respond to a notice, what's also been done is to subsume the section of best judgment assessment into this faceless assessment scheme. In which case, that where an assessee fails to respond within 15 days or any additional time may be granted, the assessing unit or the assessment unit will have the option to proceed to complete the assessment based on the information as available with it, or gathering other information through the verification unit as the case may be, and issue the draft order. So from a best judgment assessment perspective, in terms of the process, it will remain the same, that the officer will go ahead and try to conclude the assessment based on the information available with them. So that's something that is important from the perspective that all communications relating to this faceless scheme is really tracked upon on a real-time basis, because it should not be a case where notice is issued and it is our intention, of course, to respond to it, but we fail to respond to it just because we were not aware of it, of a notice having been issued. So as I mentioned, the assessment unit, or AU, as I've mentioned in the slide, will either call for documents for verification or conduct further inquiry through the verification unit, which is the VU, or seek technical assistance through the technical unit, as in cases of transfer pricing or valuations, as I said mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Again, as I said, so once the draft order is there, the assessment center can choose to send it to a review unit. In case the review unit says there are no modifications, the National Center can issue the draft order or issue a show cause notice, as the case may be. If there is any modification, then the National Center will forward it to another assessment unit, as I mentioned. And then on receipt of the revised draft order, it will either serve it on the assessee or issue a show cause notice. The once the whole assessment process is completed, the scheme requires that the documents are finally handed over to the jurisdictional assessing officer. Next slide, please. This is just an example of how notice is received looks like in cases where the notices have been issued, just to give you a flavor of how it may look like. Interestingly, one thing you have to notice is that there is a notice number, which of course used to be there even earlier. One of the requirements of the scheme is that every notice or communication has to have a document number. If not, then the scheme envisages that this document will be invalid. So that is something which is important to be mindful about. So in instances when any communication is received which does not have a identification number specifically, in most cases the notice number is itself mentioned to be the this document number as I mentioned, and in its absence, in an instance, then the notice will be invalid. Next slide, please. So as I said, the once the assessment is completed, the records will be transferred to the jurisdictional assessing officer. The assessing officer will also have other tasks in terms of collection and recovery of demand, giving effect to appellate orders, and then submitting any remand reports, etc. So to that extent, the role of the jurisdictional officer has been reduced substantially, but not that they are completely out of action. Any post-assessment work will still have to be taken up with the jurisdictional assessing officer. Next slide, please. So a few things which were to be, which were brought up as questions during interactions between the CBDT personnel and the certain taxpayers in certain forums. One of the questions which came up was that whether Section 147 will remain to be active. So the feedback that was received is that even though it's a faceless assessment scheme, which will go through an assessment unit and a review unit as the case may be, there can always be instances when something may not have been looked at, and in instances where it comes to notice that something has not been looked at, that will always be subject to a further review through the Section 147 process. So the feedback that has been received is that Section 147 will continue to remain and will continue to be used where necessary. Next slide, please. Similarly, even in terms of Section 263, the powers of the commissioner to review or recall any order, again, the same feedback has been received to say that there can always be instances where something may have got missed out. So while these two provisions may not be used more frequently, hopefully, as we hope, but in terms of whether these sections will continue to be active, it's been clearly, the messaging is very clear that both these sections will continue to remain active and will be used for reviewing orders or revising the orders as the case may be. Next slide, please. Similarly, the question which was asked, one of the questions was also asked is under 154. In fact, in the earlier slide, there was a question on rectification of orders. The question, the jurisdiction to pass any rectification order was with the jurisdictional assessing officer once the final assessment order was issued. In fact, there's been an amendment to this, which I will touch upon. But when this was, brought up at a forum prior to the amendment which has been made, the CBDT members at that point in time mentioned that that the power to rectify will continue to be with the jurisdictional AO, and they will ensure that the scheme will not fail just because of the fact that an order has been passed by the National Assessment Center and the jurisdictional officer does not take any responsibility for it. What is the amendment? I'll just come up touch upon the in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. As I said, in terms of the valuation, again, the under 142A, where the assessing officer can seek support of a valuation officer, that will happen through the National Faceless Assessment Scheme, where when the assessment unit requests for any technical inputs, the National Center will forward that request to a technical unit, which will do the valuation, or even in cases of transfer pricing cases where transfer pricing assessment has to happen, any inputs required from a TP perspective will also be given by these technical units, which the National Center will forward it back to the assessment unit, which is carrying out the assessment. And the assessment unit will take those inputs into factor that in while issuing the draft orders. Next slide, please. So this was one thing which was again a big question mark at the point, and this is where I'll also bring up on the amendment that I was talking about. Interestingly, when the e-assessment scheme was introduced last year in September 2019, it was the scheme was notified under 143(3)(a) and B, which were the provisions which were introduced last year to bring in this faceless assessment scheme. And an initial notification was issued last year in 2019, and subsequent notifications were issued in the current year, I think a couple of months ago, which again made some modifications to the original notification and the scheme that were issued. One of the things which was there in the scheme as envisaged at that point in time was the fact that it was mentioned that any order which is issued under the faceless assessment scheme, the next appellate authority for all such orders will compulsorily be the Commissioner Appeals, and it will be the jurisdictional Commissioner Appeals who will take up the appeals, with whom the appeals can be filed. This sort of created a confusion because, as we know, and it has been our experience in the past, there have been, specifically in transfer pricing cases, where there has been a draft order issued. The SSC had the option to go to the DRP panel, and once the DRP directions are issued, the final order need to be issued, and then the SSC had the option to approach the tribunal directly without having to appear before the Commissioner Appeals again. This sort of caused a lot of confusion because there is, of course, also the review unit, which we touched upon earlier in terms of the process. So the question was, there is already a review unit, then you also have the DRP panel. How will this work? Will, after review by the review unit, will there still be an option to go to the DRP for the SSC? And which is the draft order which will be forwarded to the SSC? Is it after the review unit review, or before that? So all of this confusion was there. So what's interestingly happened is that there has been, when the Taxation and Provision Certain Reliefs Act was passed on September 29th, recently, which was to give effect to the ordinance which had come out in June, or sorry, in March. Interestingly, what the government has done is to bring in the whole assessment scheme itself into the main section of the Act itself by introduction of Section 144B. So basically, what the government has done is to bring in the whole scheme almost verbatim as the way it was modified based on the notifications into the main section of the Act itself. What that means is that, and this is effective from 1st April 2021, which is for assessment year 21-22 onwards, which means for all assessments happening during the current year 19-20 as well. And again, in the same Act, what they've also done is that they have curbed the powers under 143(3)(a) and 3B, and have said that no, those two sections will not be, or subsections will not be operational with effect from 1st April 2021. Basically, what they've done is to sort of kill the notification to an extent where there was a gap, to say that the whole of these proceedings now will be part of the Act itself, and we don't have to refer to the notification anymore going forward. So with that, thankfully, what's happened is that what I mentioned about the CIT appeals thing earlier, in terms of all orders having to be appealed only before the Commissioner Appeals, which was there in the notification, that sort of gets overruled. Now, since this section has been introduced as part of 143(3) itself, as a subsection, or with a reference to 143(3), the normal provisions of the Act in terms of the DRP proceedings and the Commissioner Appeals will sort of normalize. I think this is a good thing that has been done to ensure that there are, the taxpayers do not lose the benefit of the this resolution panel option, which, if at their option they could have always taken in the past. So it's good to see that, that option will be available to the taxpayers. What will also happen is that even the dispute resolution panel process will happen through the faceless scheme itself. That's also the thing that has been brought in through the modifications or amendments made into 144C as well, which means that the timelines continue to remain the same, where the draft order is served on the assessee, and for an eligible assessee, which is a foreign company or domestic companies which have a transfer pricing adjustment, the assessee will have to again respond to say that whether they will want to go to the DRP route or not. And in case objections are filed within the timelines involved, then the DRP process will happen. And then once the DRP issues its directions, the assessment unit will take in, consider the directions and pass the order as per the directions issued by the DRP panel. So this is a clarification which is which is now, I think, clear, and I think that's quite helpful, because otherwise it would have been an instance where possibly the DRP panel would have become redundant, because the way the scheme was envisaged, if every order had to go to the CIT appeals route, then the whole provision of DRP being there would have become redundant. But by killing the notification and bringing the whole assessment scheme into the main body of the act itself, the government has reactivated the option of having the DRP option available to the taxpayers. So before we move on, I'll want to also just briefly touch upon the faceless appeal scheme as well. Even in instances where, let's say, where there is not an eligible assessee in a normal process, where there are no TP adjustments in a normal 143.3 order without TP adjustments, as I said, the option was to go to the CIT appeals, which was a jurisdictional CIT appeals. But with the introduction of the faceless appeal scheme, even that has sort of been replaced. What they have done is to bring in a scheme which is similar to how the faceless assessment scheme will work, where they will set up a national faceless appeal center and a regional appeal center. Again, all communication will happen between the taxpayer and the tax authorities through the national faceless appeal center. The faceless appeal center will allocate the appeals to the regional appeal centers, as the case may be. And of course, there have been guidelines which have been issued in terms of the normal processes which are involved during the course of an appeal, including filing of the appeal within the due date, non-admission of the appeal if there is any delay, condonation of delay, then filing of additional grounds, admission of additional grounds, as the case may be, or rejection of the additional grounds once it is filed, the option to file additional evidence under Rule 46. Again, and if whether the evidence will be admitted or not, and if admitted, then the process of forwarding it for a remand report from the assessing officer, which will now move to the assessment unit, as the case may be, and then getting inputs from there, and then finalizing the appeal order as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately under this scheme as well, now this appeal scheme has now again come out by way of a notification which was issued on 25th September, where so there is still difference now in terms of that. First, the faceless assessment scheme was by way of a scheme or a notification, which now sort of has been overridden by the bringing in the whole scheme under the Act itself. But for the appeals scheme, it is at this point still through notification which has been brought in. We don't know, maybe going forward that will also be brought into the Act as well, but that's something we can wait and see. And as I mentioned, but unfortunately under the appeal scheme as well, the way it has been structured is that even when a notice is issued and the assessee responds to it, he has to make a request. I mean, which is very uh, surprising in that sense, I mean, or unusual for us in the way we have been handling assessments and appeals all this while, where it was sort of given that once you file a response or file your uh, uh, detailed submissions in response to your grounds, it was given that we would get an hearing before the commissioner appeals or the officer, as the case may be. But under the scheme as it is envisaged now, the assessee can only make a request, and then the commissioner involved will take a call whether the uh, request will be granted or not. And hopefully the writ petition will sail through, and it will come through, and every taxpayer will have an option by right that they will get a hearing. Otherwise it may become challenging in many instances where certain nuances, etc., which possibly will have a better impact when spoken to, rather than being able to write down all of that on a piece of paper and submitting it. It's always been our experience that any face-to-face interactions, even in this case, though it will only happen through a video conferencing facility, it is still better than not having any interaction at all. I'm sure it will be helpful in that sense to be able to resolve a lot of issues which will otherwise may not get addressed by necessarily having the explaining things through written submissions, which brings me to the next point, which is that either under the appeal scheme or the assessment scheme, I think gone are the days when we would make bulky submissions of 20, 30 pages, and have bulky submissions that we used to file. I think the order of the day would be that the submissions that we will make will have to be concise and precise, because we'll also have to respond to these notices in a timely manner, and and therefore it's all the more important for taxpayers to work closely with their consultants or advisors to ensure that the right messaging is made in terms of the written submissions, which is, as I said, precise and concise. One of the things that also we have to be mindful about is the fact that again, some article that I had read a couple of months ago that I'd also sort of posted on my LinkedIn profile was the fact that the one of the officers during one of the interactions had mentioned that the tax authorities are also trying to monitor the behavior of the taxpayers in terms of how quickly they're responding to notices. Are they seeking adjournments? And how long the adjournments are being sought for? Are all the information being filed at one time? Are we doing only partial filings, etc.? Why I say that is important is because as things stand, as I said, the commissioner has the discretion to grant a hearing or not. Of course, there are supposed to be some guidelines which are to be issued as to what are the circumstances when the commissioner will grant the hearing opportunity, which is to be, not which has not been made public as of yet. But my sense is, and I'm just guessing, that these are things which a commissioner may get influenced by in terms of how our behavior has been, in terms of whether we are responding quickly enough, are we seeking unnecessary adjournments, etc., which may, I'm just guessing, may become a factor in terms of whether the commissioner will take into consideration while granting the permission for a hearing. Should it happen that the commissioner gets forms of view to say that this taxpayer is not been very forthcoming, he's been maybe in his view unnecessarily taking adjournments and trying to delay the whole process, and seeking for a hearing may just be another tool for the taxpayer to sort of delay the whole process, they may choose not to give us the hearing or the option for a hearing. So these, I mean, I'm just guessing that this may become a factor. So that is something I think we need to be mindful about. and ensure that we don't, get into that trap where we form a wrong perception maybe before the officers, so that we don't unnecessarily get prejudiced because of these things. So all the more reason for us to be proactive and ensure that we try to compile all the information as called for and file it in a timely manner as well. Few other things I think which were also brought up during some of the discussions during the forums were in terms of where notices have been issued, whether there is bulky information, whether the tax authorities will themselves be flexible enough to give a longer period of time in terms of calling for information, or will they themselves allow for part filing of information where there is a lot of information being granted for called for. So thankfully, the response that was received at that point in time was to say that this feedback is appreciated, and suitable measures will be taken to ensure that there is sufficient time available to the taxpayers to respond to the notices without any challenges. Similarly, one of the questions which had come up during the discussion was in instance, for example, that I have made a submission and I realize that there is something wrong that I've made. Is there an option for me to be able to replace that submission and proactively to say that yes, I've made the submission, but I myself have realized that there is some error in that, and therefore can I make this revised submission? So again, the feedback that was received was that while at this point in time there may not be an option to do that in terms of the system process, but there's something that they have taken back as a feedback, and they will ensure that such a facility is made available so that the taxpayer does not suffer, and whenever he has himself noticed some errors, he can voluntarily be given an option to rectify those as well, so that it doesn't again leave any confusion or prejudice in the minds of the assessment unit and officer who's looking at these cases. So briefly, this is what we wanted to sort of bring to your attention about the faceless scheme at this point in time. Still early days. There have been a couple of clients for whom we have received notices. So just an intimation to say that the assessment is going to happen through the faceless scheme. No progress has happened after that at this point in time as we speak. So that's another. It will be a learning experience for all of us, I'm sure, and hopefully as things go forward, we hope that the intention of bringing the scheme is served, and taxpayers do get a fair deal out of this and are not any worse off than before, because the intention is to make it better, and hopefully it will end up being better. So with that, I would like to move to the next section, which is the tax collection at source. Okay, so the other thing, okay, so before we do that, let's touch upon this last slide. So the other thing that is also sort of is a feature of this faceless scheme, if I were to say, is the limited scrutiny thing, which means that earlier whenever a notice was issued, you could never make out which was a limited scrutiny or a full scrutiny, as the case may be. Every notice was with the notion that it will be a full scrutiny where the assessing officer can in fact call for any information, and all of that will have to be submitted. But under the faceless scheme, they've tried to make a distinction to say that there will be mostly instances where the scrutiny will be a limited scrutiny, where there will be very pointed and specific questions which will be asked, only which will that the taxpayer will have to respond to. It will not be open-ended kind of a thing where anything and everything will be asked in all cases. Only in certain instances where they believe there are risks involved, and where they believe there is any evidence of any escapement of income escaping assessment, is when they will look at converting a scrutiny into a full scrutiny. So again, I think this is sort of helpful because what it will do is also that the taxpayers will have a chance to be able to respond quickly. And the notion in this case will be that any question that has not been asked at this point in time means that not something that the assessment unit will be passing an order on without our knowledge or consent. So, but at the same time, a limited scrutiny does not still mean that a 147 or a 263 cannot happen, because as I've said earlier, that is something that they have not done away with. So maybe the process of the assessment itself may be faster, but there is always the risk of a 147 or a 263 going forward. But at least on a real-time basis, I think it will be good if most cases happen to be under limited scrutiny, because maybe the issues are not really repetitive in most cases, etc., and some positions would already have been taken. So in which case, then they may not necessarily disturb the taxpayers, income in all instances and in every aspect, but will be specific to certain areas which the taxpayer can respond to, and the assessment can be quickly closed in a positive way. So we've already talked about the timelines as well. Yeah. So moving forward, this is the tax collection at source section that has been introduced in October. Briefly, the tax collection at source mechanism is not new to us. It's under section 206C and has been there for a while, covering a lot of instances in the past. Next slide, please. So as I said, so 206C1 already covered TCS on liquor, timber, tendu, scrap, etc. 206C1C was introduced for parking lot, toll plaza, etc. And C1F was also introduced to cover motor vehicles. From 1st October, 3 new additions have been made to this tax collection at source provisions, which is 1G, for foreign remittances under the liberalization scheme, 1GB for overseas tour and program package, and 6C1H, which is for sale of goods. For the purpose of our discussion, limiting it to the C1H at this point in time. If you guys have, if you have any questions around the other two, please do drop in your questions, and post session we will ensure that we will respond to those questions that you have on the other two sections as well. Next slide, please. So briefly, this is how the C1H is supposed to work, where basically it is to cover all such instances which are not already covered under 1H, and this is specifically for sale of goods. Just to clarify and make it clear, it is not applicable in terms of sale of services. It's only for sale of goods, 1. 2, if there are any goods which are already covered under other sections of the TCS, which is, as we talked about, scrap or into leaves and things like that, liquor as the case may be, this will again not come under 1H. Those will continue to be under the existing earlier regulations as the case may be. Then the third thing to be taken care of is the fact that this is only for domestic sales. Any exports is again out of the purview. The fourth point, or the main trigger point for a seller that has to be is the turnover criteria, which means that for the current year 1920, what we will need to do is to check what was the turnover of the seller for FY 18-19, and only in cases where the seller's turnover exceeds 10 crores in FY 18-19 will the seller be required to comply with the regulations in 1920. So this is a test. I think it will have to be undertaken every year. So for example, in 18-19, the turnover was exceeding 10 crores. So in 1920, it's applicable to me. For whatever reason, and of course, given the economic circumstances, maybe if it's a situation in 1920 that my turnover does not exceed 10 crores in the current year, then 2021, this provision will not be applicable to me. But again, in 2021, if my turnover exceeds 10 crores, it will be applicable in 2020, 21, 22. So this is a test that will have to be done every year by the seller. Then there has to be a monetary consideration involved, which means any transfer to branch, etc., where there is no consideration, or when you send it for a job work without any consideration and you receive it back, those are not strictly sale of goods. Then this will not be applicable. Then the third trigger point is that the receipts will have to be exceeding 50 lakhs. And fourth, of course, there are certain categories who are excluded from it. And the rate of tax will be 0.1% or 0.075% because of the benefit that has been granted until March 21. Normally, it's 0.1% in cases where PAN and Aadhaar is available. And if it's not, then it is 1%. Next slide, please. So as I touched upon, the turnover has to be greater than 10 crores. Export of goods is exempted. And I'll come to the third bullet in a while. Without making adjustment, I think so. Yeah, I think these 3 points we will cover as we move along in the next slide. I think so. This was the primary question I think most people had in terms of the applicability as to what is the incidence of collecting the tax. So the question is whether the tax is to be collected when both the amount of sale and amount of receipt exceeds 50 lakhs during the year, or it has to be collected when amount of sale only exceeds 50 lakhs during the year, or it has to be collected when the amount received exceeds 50 lakhs during the year. So I think just to make it clear, this section requires a collection of tax only in instances where the receipt is greater than 50 lakhs, which means it's not A, it's not B, it's only in instances of C where the TCS provisions relating to sale of goods will be applicable. Then moving on. Again, I think whether motor vehicle, again, this is I think one instance where though motor vehicle is covered under 1F, there may be instances where it 1H may also be applicable. This is also something which was clarified by way of a FAQ that was issued by the department. So specifically, when there is B2B sales between the company and the distributor itself, when there is it's not a single sale of vehicle, and when there is bulk sale of vehicles from the manufacturer to the distributor, and subsequently there is consideration received which is greater than 50 lakhs, then 2061H may be applicable, even though sale of vehicle specifically for an individual sale is covered under 1F. So this is one instance where it can work in both places. Next slide, please. The next question is, let's say if I'm buying computer software, will I have to do a TCS? So the question is, the other thing that has also been made very clear is the fact that in any instance when a buyer is going to make a TDS deduction against the payment being made to the seller, then TCS will not be applicable. So in an instance when the buyer takes a position that this is computer software which require deduction of under 194J as royalty, then TCS will not be applicable. But in an instance where the buyer says that no, it's a off-the-shelf software and it's a good, then the seller will be required to collect TCS on this instance. Next slide, please. Whether out-of-pocket expenses should form part of the sale consideration? Yes. There has been no distinction made in terms of the what should be covered or not. In fact, adding to the next point as well in terms of GST as well. So the as things stand, unless of course it was not again touched upon, it was touched upon, sorry, in the FAQs as well, to say that the TCS has to be collected on the full amount of consideration, which means let's say the invoice is for let's say 100 rupees for the good, then some 10 rupees as some out of pocket expense, and another 18 rupees as GST. The total invoice value is 128. So the TCS has to be collected on 128 and not only on 100. Next slide, please. The other point has also been clarified is that any consideration received in terms of cash, when I say cash in terms of money is received, whether it is against an invoice or even in instances when there is a 100% advance received prior to delivery of goods itself, TCS will be applicable. So any advance for goods received, TCS will be applicable. That's also something that is quite clear. Next question is, previous slide, please. Stock transfer, as I said earlier, since there will be no consideration involved, TCS should not be applicable in a case of a stock transfer. Next slide. Whether credit note can be adjusted against sale consideration. The point here is that the TCS has to be on the amounts received. So for example, let's say as a seller, I have sold goods worth 100 rupees. The buyer accepts goods worth 90 rupees and sends back 10 goods worth 10 rupees as sales return. So ultimate purchase that the buyer has made is only for 90, and the buyer will only make a payment for 90. So when the buyer is making the payment, he will definitely not make a payment of 100. So the amount on which TCS has to be collected is the amount which the buyer will ultimately pay, which in this case, if there are any credit notes because of sales returns or any other adjustments, the amount that the buyer will pay will be the net of these amounts. So TCS will also have to be collected only on the net amount, which is 90 in the example that we talked about. Now, the 50 lakhs threshold, previous slide, please. Now, I think there was some confusion around this as well as to what is the limit and from when do we calculate the limit. So again, a clarification has been issued. The time to start looking at when the threshold will be exceeded is from 1st April 2020. But the TCS has to be collected only on receipts post 1st October 2020. As an example, as we mentioned, let's say until 1st October, we have already received 1 crore. And subsequent to 1st October, on say we have received another 5 lakh rupees. From a threshold perspective, for the year, the threshold is exceeded because it is exceeding 50 lakh rupees. But the 1 crore has been received prior to 1st October. Only 5 lakhs has been received prior subsequent to 1st October. So TCS will have to be collected in this instance only in the 5 lakh rupees or any further remittances as that may be received, but not on the earlier 1 crore which has been received earlier. And again, importantly, I want to stress on the fact that the TCS has to be collected on any receipts. And when I say any receipts, it means, let's say for instance, there has been a sale which has been booked in the previous year of 80 lakh rupees, for which the payment has not been received. And let's say the payment, if 80 lakhs is received at one shot, let's say it was received today, which is 27th October. So in this instance, though the sale relates to the last year, but given that the remittance has been received in the current year and the remittance has been received subsequent to 1st October, and the fact that the amount exceeds the threshold of 50 lakh rupees, TCS will have to be collected on the entire amount. Sorry, next slide, please. I'll just take a pause here. So these are the due dates which can be looked at, and you can also move to the next slide, which has the details on payment of the mode and the okay. Next slide, please. I think we have only 4 more minutes. Let me quickly touch upon the equalization levy. So it's not new in terms of the levy itself. Something was introduced already in 2016 relating to advertisements, etc. Equalization levy 2.0 has been also introduced as we look at it as. Next slide, please. This is on e-commerce operators, and it's at 2%. Okay, so in summary, given the time constraint we have, I think few things that I'd like to highlight here is for those already familiar with the equalization levy relating to the earlier levy which was there. The fundamental difference is that in the earlier levy, the onus on collecting and remitting the levy was on the recipient of the service or the buyer, as the case may be. Typically, how a TDS would work. But in this case, the responsibility on paying the levy has been imposed on the seller itself, in this case being the non-resident e-commerce operator. So in short, any domestic taxpayers who are having transactions with non-resident e-commerce operators, you don't have to worry about any compliances or requirements at this point under this levy. The onus here is on the non-resident e-commerce operator to make the payments. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think this is important in respect of what I was saying. So under the earlier levy, given that the purchaser had the duty to collect and remit this levy, in instances where the person failed to do that, then the amount in terms of the expense would not be allowed as a deduction because the levy was not collected and remitted, and was allowed whenever the levy was subsequently paid. But in this instance, again, that will not be the case, as I said, because the requirement to pay the levy is on the non-resident e-commerce operator. One thing I think that will have to be, which is common to both these levies, is the fact that if there is a levy, will there also have to be a TDS? Under the earlier levy, given that we used to do the deduction of the levy itself, then there was an exemption under 1050. So given that it was not an income, once a levy is being charged, then a TDS would not have been necessitated. Similarly, in the current instance also, there is an exemption under 1050, but that's an exemption that the e-commerce operator will have to claim. From a domestic payers perspective, in instances wherever you are deducting taxes, it is our suggestion that you continue to do that, because you cannot verify whether the non-resident operator has paid the levy or not. So you will not be aware whether he is eligible for that exemption or not. So from your perspective, our suggestion would be that you can continue to follow your approach of withholding taxes if that's what you are doing. And wherever if there is an exemption that has to be claimed by the non-resident e-commerce operator, then the operator can do that on his own. Next slide, please. Of course, and these are again more from the instances of the taxpayer ultimately in terms of what will happen to the levy. Will there be a credit or not? Unfortunately, this is not a levy which is part of the Income Tax Act, and in most instances of double taxation avoidance agreements, the amount which is covered for relief are generally taxes paid under the Income Tax Act. And given that both these levies are have been introduced through Finance Acts and therefore not part of the Income Tax Act itself, unfortunately, the person for whom the levy has been deducted, who is a non-resident, will not be able to claim any relief under the DTA. Of course, there are no ambiguities around it in terms of what should be the value, and if suppose the threshold is not exceeded. For example, for the earlier levy, the threshold was 1 lakh. The new levy, the threshold is 2 crores. let's say to be on a safer side, I start doing the deduction from day one in anticipation that the levy will be or the threshold will be exceeded. Will I get a refund? Under the new levy, of course, there is a provision to say that an annual statement has to be filed by the e-commerce operator at the end of the year, and if there are instances when there is a refund or excess payment of levy, that will be granted as a refund to the e-commerce operator. The other big issue in terms of the new levy is, of course, one thing is that it says the levy has to be paid on all sales made to Indian residents, which is pretty straightforward. I think where it gets tricky is that it says for customers who use an Indian IP address. For example, let's say there's a foreign national who's come to India on a vacation, and he uses, let's say, some service of Apple, and she makes a download on Apple Music. Now, that person is not an Indian resident, of course, but merely for the fact that he made the purchase of Apple Music in being in India using an IP address in India, because once you're in roaming, you're more likely than not be accessing the internet through the Indian IP address. Then possibly that may be subjected to the levy for Apple. That's where the things get a little tricky and murkier. Similar, the flip side will also happen. For example, let's say I go to US or Europe, or many of us go to these places for vacation. And for example, there is a similar app to Uber in those locations, and we book a cab there. Tax on this because he's a non-e-commerce operator. These are some of the challenges which are unfortunately there based on the way the levy has been worded at this point in time. And what's also interesting to note is the fact that for some reason the government has stated that in their view the language of the levy is quite clear, and at this point in time they have said that they don't feel the need to issue any guidelines or clarifications or FAQs at this point in time. So I think at least to the non-resident operators wherever involved, they'll have to really make a conscious call on whether they'll pay the levy or not. And and interestingly, last month I was reading that some of the bigger names like Google and Adobe have in fact made a payment as well. So I think this is something which is still developing. We'll have to see over the next few months how this will transpire. And hopefully there'll be some guidelines which may come up regarding this. But at least from a domestic perspective, as I said, the new levy does not have any immediate impact on the Indian taxpayers, because unlike the earlier levy where the onus was on us to deduct the levy, in this instance, the onus on paying the levy is on the seller itself. I think that is something that we can take away at this point in time. So with that, I would like to conclude the discussion. Unfortunately, I think we have crossed the timeline that we had envisaged. Avinash, are there any questions?
Currently, no, but anyone who has any questions, you can please send us to avinash.ramuri@asa.in, and I will be happy to respond to you with the answers.
Fair enough. So thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us. As Avinash mentioned, we'll be more than happy to address any questions that you may have on these topics that we touched upon, or anything else that you may have. Please drop in email with your question, and we will respond to it as soon as possible.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. It was great hosting you. We will share the recording of the webinar. Please do share it with your colleagues and let us know your feedback and questions. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good evening.